In the year 1405, something impossible appeared on the horizon of the Indian Ocean. Not one ship, not 10 ships, but 317 vessels, moving in formation like a floating city. The flagship alone was longer than a football field. 450 feet of Chinese engineering that wouldn't be matched by European shipbuilders for another 4 centuries. Its 9 masts towered 15 stories high, carrying red silk sails that could be seen for miles. The hull was divided into watertight compartments, a technology Europe wouldn't discover until the 1800s. This was the treasure fleet of Admiral Zheng He. And it was about to change everything we thought we knew about the age of exploration. Because here's what they don't teach you in school. While Europe was still sailing glorified rowboats along their own coastlines, China had already built the most advanced navy the world had ever seen. And they weren't exploring. They were projecting power on a scale that wouldn't be matched until the British Empire, 3 centuries later. But this story isn't just about ships. It's about how one emperor decided to announce China's dominance to the entire known world, how a former slave became the greatest admiral in history, and how the most powerful navy ever assembled was deliberately destroyed and erased from history by the very empire that created it. The treasure fleets represent the single greatest what-if in economic history. Because if China had continued these voyages for just a few more decades, there might never have been a European age of exploration at all. So how did a eunuch admiral command a fleet that dwarfed anything Europe could imagine? How did China reach the coast of Africa 70 years before the Portuguese? And why did the most powerful maritime empire in history deliberately destroy its own navy and burn the records of its achievements? Let's find out. To understand the treasure fleets, you need to understand the man who commanded them. Zheng He was born Ma He in 1371 in China's Yunnan province. He wasn't ethnically Han Chinese. He was Hui, from a Muslim family with connections to the Mongol ruling class. His father and grandfather had both made the pilgrimage to Mecca, giving young Ma He stories of distant lands and foreign peoples. But in 1381, when Ma He was just 10 years old, everything changed. The Ming Dynasty was consolidating power, crushing the last remnants of Mongol influence in China's southwest. Yunnan fell. Ma He's father was killed, and the young boy was captured, castrated, and forced into service as a eunuch in the Ming imperial household. This was his life now. A slave. A eunuch. Stripped of his family, his manhood, his identity. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Ma He was assigned to the household of Zhu Di, the Prince of Yan, and the prince recognized something in this young eunuch: intelligence, loyalty, military aptitude. As Zhu Di plotted to overthrow his nephew and seize the imperial throne, he became one of his most trusted commanders. In 1402, after a brutal civil war, Zhu Di became the Yongle Emperor. One of his first acts was to reward Ma He with a new name, Zheng He, and with that name came an impossible task. The new emperor wanted to do something no Chinese ruler had ever attempted. He wanted to project Chinese power across the entire maritime world, to establish tributary relationships with every kingdom, from Java to the coast of Africa, to prove that China was the unquestioned center of the civilized world. And he wanted Zheng He to be his instrument. But why? Why would an emperor who had just fought a civil war immediately launch the most expensive peacetime operation in Chinese history? The official reason was diplomacy and trade. The real reasons were more complex. First, there were rumors that the previous emperor, Zhu Di's nephew, hadn't actually died in the civil war, but had escaped by sea. Zheng He's fleet would search for him while projecting power. Second, the Yongle Emperor wanted to restore the tribute system. For centuries, neighboring kingdoms had sent embassies to China with gifts, acknowledging Chinese superiority. In return, China would grant them trading privileges and protection. The system had broken down. The emperor wanted it rebuilt on a scale never before attempted. Third, and perhaps most important, Zheng He's voyages were about prestige. The Yongle emperor had seized power through rebellion. He needed to legitimize his rule through grand achievements. Building the Forbidden City was one part of this strategy. The treasure fleets were another. So in 1405, Zheng He was given command of the largest navy ever assembled and sent to the edge of the known world. The scale of the first expedition is almost incomprehensible. 317 ships, 27,870 men, sailors, soldiers, diplomats, translators, physicians, astronomers, cartographers, and scribes. The largest ships, the treasure ships, displaced 1,500 tons and required crews of 500 men each. For comparison, when Christopher Columbus sailed to the Americas 87 years later, he had 3 ships and 90 men. His flagship, the Santa Maria, was about 70 feet long. Zheng He's treasure ships were more than 6 times that size. The fleet carried everything needed for a multi-year voyage: food, water, and supplies for thousands of men, diplomatic gifts, silk, porcelain, gold, silver, weapons and armor, even agricultural supplies, so the fleet could plant crops at extended stops. And they carried something else, a message. China was the Middle Kingdom, the center of civilization. Every other nation was peripheral. Submit to Chinese authority, join the tribute system, and prosper. Resist, and face the consequences. This wasn't exploration. This was a floating declaration of hegemony. Between 1405 and 1433, Zheng He led 7 massive expeditions across the Indian Ocean. Let me walk you through what made these voyages so extraordinary. The first voyage set the template. The fleet sailed south from Nanjing, down the Chinese coast to Champa, modern Vietnam, then across the South China Sea to Java. From there, through the Strait of Malacca, the choke point of Asian maritime trade, and into the Indian Ocean. This was where things got interesting, because the Indian Ocean wasn't empty water waiting to be discovered. It was the center of a thriving, interconnected trading world that had existed for centuries. Arab traders dominated the Western Indian Ocean. Indian merchants controlled the coasts of the subcontinent. Southeast Asian kingdoms controlled the critical straits. Chinese merchants had been trading in these waters for generations, but never with official state backing on this scale. Zheng He's fleet visited Calicut on India's western coast, one of the wealthiest trading ports in the world. They visited Ceylon. They sailed to Hormuz at the entrance to the Persian Gulf, the gateway to the Middle East. And everywhere they went, they made China's presence known. Local rulers were presented with elaborate gifts and offered membership in the Chinese tribute system. Some accepted immediately, seeing the commercial advantages. Others were more reluctant. Which brings us to the first use of force. In 1407, during the second voyage, the Chinese fleet encountered a problem. A Chinese-born pirate named Chen Zui had established himself as a power broker in Palembang, on the island of Sumatra. He controlled the Strait of Malacca and was threatening Chinese merchant ships. Zheng He's response was swift and brutal. The treasure fleet ambushed Chen Zui's forces, killed over 5,000 pirates, and captured Chen Zui himself. He was brought back to China in chains and publicly executed. The message was clear. China would protect its maritime interests with overwhelming force if necessary. But the fleet wasn't just about military power. It was also about knowledge. Zheng He's ships carried scholars who documented everything they saw: languages, customs, trade goods, navigation routes, coastal features. This information was compiled into detailed reports and maps that gave China an unprecedented understanding of the maritime world. The fleet also engaged in active diplomacy. Chinese envoys negotiated treaties. They mediated disputes between local rulers. They established Chinese embassies in key ports. And the economic impact was enormous. The treasure ships carried Chinese goods, silk, porcelain, tea, metalwork, and traded them for exotic products that commanded premium prices back home. Spices, precious stones, rare woods, exotic animals. One voyage brought back a giraffe from East Africa. The animal caused a sensation in Beijing. Court scholars declared it must be the Qilin, a mythical creature whose appearance signaled divine approval of the emperor's rule. The propaganda value alone justified the expedition's cost. The fourth voyage, from 1413 to 1415, pushed even further. The fleet reached Hormuz and then continued down the east coast of Africa. Chinese ships visited Mogadishu, Mombasa, and Malindi in modern Somalia, Kenya, respectively. Think about that for a moment. Chinese ships were trading in African ports in 1414. The Portuguese wouldn't reach the same region until the 1490s, more than 70 years later. The fifth and sixth voyages, between 1417 and 1422, expanded the tribute network even further. More kingdoms joined. More trade routes were established. Chinese maritime power was now unchallenged from Southeast Asia to East Africa. But back in China, things were changing. The Yongle Emperor died in 1424. His son, the Hongxi Emperor, took power with a very different vision for China. The treasure voyages were staggeringly expensive. Each expedition cost enormous amounts of silver. Some estimates suggest the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars in today's money. The Hongxi Emperor looked at these costs and saw waste. He also faced opposition from the Confucian scholar officials who dominated the Chinese bureaucracy. These officials had always viewed the voyages with suspicion. They believed China's focus should be internal: agriculture, infrastructure, defense of the northern border against Mongol raiders. Maritime trade, in their view, was vulgar and unnecessary. China produced everything it needed. Why waste resources on foreign adventures? The Hongxi Emperor agreed. He suspended the treasure voyages after less than a year on the throne. But then he died. His son, the Zhuande Emperor, took power in 1426 and decided to launch one final expedition, perhaps to complete unfinished diplomatic business, perhaps to reassert Chinese prestige, perhaps because Zheng He himself convinced him. In 1431, at age 60, Zheng He led his seventh and final voyage. This expedition visited many of the same ports as before, reinforcing tributary relationships and updating maps. It was as grand as the earlier voyages, over 100 ships, 27,000 men. But it had a different feeling. This wasn't the start of something. It was an ending. Zheng He himself died during this voyage, probably in 1433, on the return journey. Some sources say he was buried at sea near Calicut. Others suggest he made it back to China but died shortly after arrival. With Zheng He's death, the treasure fleet era ended. The Zhuande Emperor died in 1435. His successor, the Zhengtong Emperor, was only 8 years old. The Confucian officials who had always opposed the voyages now had free rein, and they acted decisively. First, they stopped building treasure ships. Then they redirected resources to the northern frontier. Then, most remarkably, they began destroying records. The detailed logs of Zheng He's voyages, the navigation charts, the diplomatic reports, the maps, were systematically burned or hidden. When one official later tried to access these records for historical research, he was told they had been destroyed to save paper. By 1500, it was illegal to build ships with more than 2 masts. By 1525, it was illegal to build ocean-going ships at all. China's coastal communities were forcibly relocated inland. Maritime trade was restricted. China, which had possessed the most advanced navy in the world, deliberately dismantled it and turned inward. This is one of the great mysteries of economic history. Why would a civilization that had achieved such maritime dominance voluntarily abandon it? The traditional explanation points to Confucian philosophy and bureaucratic politics. The scholar officials won their ideological battle. agriculture and internal stability trumped maritime adventure. But there were also practical factors. The treasure voyages really were expensive, and China faced real threats on its northern border. The Mongols remained a constant danger. The Great Wall needed maintenance and expansion. From a strategic perspective, defending the northern frontier made more sense than projecting power across distant oceans. There's also an economic argument. China didn't actually need maritime trade. The empire was largely self-sufficient. The luxury goods brought back by the treasure fleets were nice, but not necessary. European nations, by contrast, desperately needed maritime trade because they lacked access to Asian spices, silk, and other goods. But here's what haunts historians: the timing. China turned inward just as European maritime technology was advancing. Just as Portugal was beginning its explorations down the African coast. Just as Spain was starting to think about westward routes to Asia. If China had maintained the treasure fleet system for just another 50 years, what would have happened when Portuguese ships rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488 and entered the Indian Ocean? They would have found Chinese naval bases, Chinese trading posts, a well-established Chinese maritime empire. Would there have been a European age of exploration at all? Would the Portuguese and Spanish have been able to establish their trading empires in Asia? Would the entire global economic system have developed differently? We'll never know. Because China made a choice. And that choice shaped the next 500 years of world history. So what do we make of Zheng He and his treasure fleets? From a purely technical standpoint, they represent the peak of medieval shipbuilding and navigation. Chinese naval technology in the early 1400s was at least a century ahead of Europe. The treasure ships used watertight compartments, balanced rudders, multiple masts, and magnetic compasses, innovations that European ships would only slowly adopt over the next 2 centuries. From a diplomatic standpoint, the voyages successfully established Chinese influence across maritime Asia and the Indian Ocean. Dozens of kingdoms sent tribute missions to Beijing. Chinese prestige was at an all-time high. From an economic standpoint, the impact is more complex. The treasure fleets did facilitate trade, but they also represented massive government expenditure with questionable returns. They were fundamentally about prestige and power projection, not profit. And from a historical standpoint, they represent the road not taken. China possessed the technology, the resources, and the organizational capacity to establish a genuine maritime empire. Not just trading posts, but permanent colonial settlements. Not just diplomatic influence, but territorial control. They chose not to, and within a century, European powers were doing exactly what China had declined to do. Establishing trading posts, claiming territories, extracting resources. By the time European ships reached Chinese waters in significant numbers in the 1500s, China's maritime capabilities had atrophied. The Ming Dynasty built coastal fortifications and tried to control trade through Canton, but they no longer had the naval power to enforce their wishes. The irony is striking. China discovered Europe's trading partners in Africa, and the Middle East generations before Europe discovered China's trading partners in Southeast Asia. But Europe turned its discoveries into empire, while China turned away from the ocean entirely. Some historians argue this was China's great mistake, that if they had maintained maritime power, they could have prevented European colonialism in Asia entirely. Others argue it was a rational choice based on China's actual strategic needs and economic realities. But here's what we know for certain. Zheng He's treasure fleets demonstrated that maritime exploration and power projection weren't uniquely European capabilities. China did it first and did it bigger. The ships were larger, the distances were greater, the organization was more sophisticated, and it all happened before Europe even knew these ocean routes existed. Today, very little physical evidence of the treasure fleets remains. A few anchors, some scattered records that survived the deliberate destruction, indirect accounts from foreign observers. But the memory persists. In China, Zheng He is celebrated as a symbol of Chinese maritime achievement. His voyages are taught as examples of peaceful diplomacy and cultural exchange, contrasted with European colonialism. In Southeast Asia, His legacy is more mixed. Some see him as a powerful admiral who brought Chinese influence to the region. Others see him as an imperial enforcer who demanded submission. The treasure ships themselves are gone. The detailed records are lost. Even the exact size of the ships is debated. Some scholars think later accounts exaggerated their dimensions. But the fundamental story is undeniable. For a brief window in the early 1400s, China possessed the greatest navy the world had ever seen. And then, by choice, they let it go. So here's the question that economic historians still debate. Was China's decision to abandon maritime power a mistake? The traditional view says yes. China missed its chance to shape the global economy. They could have prevented European colonialism. They could have established a Chinese-dominated trading system across Asia and beyond. The revisionist view says no. China made a rational choice based on their actual needs. Maritime trade wasn't essential to Chinese prosperity. The northern border was the real threat. The treasure voyages were expensive vanity projects that didn't generate sufficient returns. But there's a third possibility that historians are only recently beginning to explore. Maybe the treasure fleets weren't really about trade at all. Maybe they were about demonstrating that China didn't need maritime trade, that they were so powerful, so wealthy, so self-sufficient, that they could project power across oceans purely for prestige. If that's true, then abandoning the fleets wasn't a mistake. It was the logical conclusion of the demonstration. China had proved its point. It didn't need to maintain expensive fleets permanently, because it didn't need anything the maritime world had to offer. Europe, by contrast, desperately needed Asian goods. So they built the ships, learned the routes, and eventually used maritime power to reshape the global economy to their advantage. The treasure fleets of Zheng He represent a fundamentally different approach to wealth and power. Not accumulation through trade and colonization, but demonstration through overwhelming prestige. And in that sense, maybe China achieved exactly what they set out to do. They proved they were the center of the world. And then, having proved it, they decided the cost of continuing to prove it wasn't worth paying. Whether that was wisdom or folly, we're still debating 600 years later. What we can say for certain is this: the greatest navy the medieval world ever saw wasn't built by Europe. It was built by China. And the fact that most people don't know that tells you everything you need to know about who got to write the history of the age of exploration. The treasure fleets explored the world. Then China chose to forget they ever existed. And that choice changed everything.